So, first of all, I'm a journalist first and foremost and a filmmaker by training, but I see all of this through the lens of journalism and storytelling. So I have a perspective that brings me into the world of ethics pretty quickly. So I'm right there, and a lot of the stuff that you guys talk about it borders on that and storytelling. So I just have a first question, and I'm going to start with Karim, who's over on our right. Can you talk to me about what keeps you up at night around this, ethically speaking? And then I would love to hear from you all that question.
Could you repeat the question?
Yes. So when you think about this through the ethical lens, so through the lens of, perhaps the ethical dangers or the part of this that makes you uncomfortable, the work that you're seeing or experiencing or questions that you have in your own work, what worries you or what keeps you up at night? And I really appreciate that some of you are really saying, we have to come together as a community and discuss these ethics. And I would love to start that discussion here.
Well, when it comes to my experience, being a war correspondent, I'm very wary of war. And when it came to the enemy, it's never been about bringing people at war, but bringing the people who makes war to you. Because I think I've been on the bomb. I've seen too many dead people for my job, and I don't think there is, for me, something that you learn beside the emotions of what you live there. And I think the medium is way too powerful also in a way that you could easily traumatize people. So I'm wary of that. It doesn't keep me up at night because I didn't took that direction. But that's something I'm concerned to some extent. And then for the rest, it's trying to move journalism the way I'm doing it into this new dimension, and yeah, it's trying to see, can I create a room that doesn't exist and put people in that never been in a face-to-face? That's an ethical question, but so far I've had a lot of journalists going in and nobody has raised a flag and say what you do is wrong, right. Because I'm doing the same, I've done the same photographically, and I'm just moving this into VR now.
So interestingly, The Enemy was my first virtual experience, if we can call it that. So the first discussions I started to have were with Karim and others at the Open Doc Lab, really experiencing this, and absolutely felt that this was a form of very, very powerful journalism in its own right. Nonny?
I kind of want to also ask a little question, because I've just been taking people in and thinking about the false memory issues, and in investigative pieces, we look a lot at police interrogations and why do people confess, right? We know there's a lot of false confessions out there. What would be the ethical implications? And honestly, I don't know, it's just a question really, this just occurred to me. Can we then create false confessions and we then shine a light on how easily this happens with police interrogations, since we know that it happens, but we've never been able to kind of prove it?
Well,
it's sort of a weird idea. Sorry, I'm being very, I know I'm throwing out something very strange, I know.
Really
so when you tell a story, we try to show that this happens. Is there something, I'm not saying that's ethical. I'm just saying it's kind of an interesting thought I'm having.
Needs to be studied.
Go ahead,
Someone in the room, please.
Yeah, I think she's called Elizabeth Loftus. She already did a lot of research about the false memories in police
I've interviewed her many times, actually.
Okay, yeah. What keeps me up at night, or what worries me a little bit, is that sort of with VR, I feel like you can make a moldable human. You can recreate or reform yourself in a way, but others could also mold you or reform you in a way, maybe because without you even knowing, and that's maybe a bit scary.
So I'll give two answers at two different levels here. And so the first one is with this particular project. And so it's this idea that whenever you construct a kind of parallel narrative where you have multiple narratives at the same time with the same structures, which is something that is being done in this project, then you want to be aware of the contingencies and the history of the conflict itself and of the background of the story. That is, are you saying that each particular point of view is commensurate with the other by giving them this kind of platform. I think that's not what's going on in The Enemy, because it's creating a system which does construct a kind of parallel there, but it actually begins to bring you into a kind of intimate space rather than a kind of spectacle space that brings them to you and allows you to engage in this kind of journalistic interaction and a dialogue with them. And the point really isn't to ask the soldiers about the backstories of the conflicts or about the complex histories there, but rather about their particular individual kind of experiences, their trajectories of their families. I think in that parallel, that's where you begin to see the similarities and differences that emerge. But I've seen other types of interactive narrative systems, and it's something I've been quite aware of, where if you take a different kind of ideologies and say, oh, one ideology is a kind of extremist ideology or a fundamentalist ideology, and then put that on the same platform with other types of ideology or any type of ideology that has some kind of contested status, really, then you want to be sort of very aware of the platform and the situation that you're constructing there. And so I think really it's the kind of the fact that Karim is going there to these places, interacting with people one-on-one as his embodied human presence, somebody who's sensitive to this conflict, that really mitigates against these kind of issues in this case. And then the second thing I would mention is just more an issue that keeps me up, that's say with us as creators of the system, which is just this one that it's the idea that you could actually build a system that allows you to walk in another's shoes, because it's this idea, we're just taking these systems, you're taking everything from the real physical world and the histories and our identities and our bodies and the kind of violence of the real world, and then reducing it through the algorithm and the data structure, which is a very kind of reduced experience. And so for me, the idea that you can actually recreate those experiences isn't really the core of it. Rather, it's something more like was mentioned in some of these panels, which is about education, about particular kind of new models and new kind of cognitive models. And so that is, a simulation is not to give you the experience of what's being simulated in these kind of cases, but rather to take all of that complexity from the real world, find some salient features and construct a kind of rhetoric around it that people can then engage with, and hopefully get that model and think about it in a critical new way. And I think that kind of critical thinking around these issues is, in my opinion, what we should be going for, rather than the idea that we can actually walk in somebody's shoes without the kind of potential of the kind of physical repercussions or violence of the real world.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Great. And when you're looking at this, especially through the lens that you look, what do you see?
Yeah, there are so many lenses. I look at it through the implications and consequences of things, especially regarding attention and habit. Everybody knows what this means, right? You know, this little thing, or what it means to tweet. And you can observe a kind of habit of reducing our attention span, which is in the end a kind of attention deficit disorder on a global scale. It has certain good things about it because we can follow our curiosity. It has certain bad things in the sense that we don't pay attention. If you do pay attention, and I should say here that it's been quite a while now when I decided that the world as presented to me was presented backwards from the present to the roots. It's like trying to understand a tree from the leaves, not the roots. And at some point I decided I had to go back to thousands of years ago and read everything century by century through the West, through the East, through the American Indians, through whatever cultures I could, and get to the present, which in the end can be done, and I've done it. And then you find, no, I'm saying
That's
it
amazing.
because we're told that we can't. And no one tests it, and so then you say, well, maybe I'll die first. And then I didn't die, I did it. It's actually great. It turns out that Elon Musk apparently read the entire Encyclopedia Britannica and decided he was going to save the world, and became Elon Musk. So anyway, if you find this, you'll eventually back yourself into Aristotle, who describes what ethics is, and says that ethics is the habit. Actually, ethics is the manner of life of a creature in its own environment. Basically the idea of an umwelt. So horses have ethics and spiders have ethics. And when you get to human beings, we have ethics too, but we're more complex. So we have to get to our ethics through habits. And our culture gives us those habits. And so then you ask, well, what habits are we building? These technologies, what habits are they encouraging? Are they encouraging a habit of dissociation or association? Not because they're VR, but because of where the vector of attention is pointing. So I can put some of these examples that we're seeing, and through them come closer to nature, come closer to people, come closer to society, or I can escape. And I think that's the difference. I mean, what worries me is that the deck is stacked, that really we have, in the end, as much as I'm an artist and a scientist and I live in highly abstract, strange, mental, poetic spaces, in the end, the reality I'm in is constructed specifically, and you can look up these books, that's why I put them up there. It's constructed strategically to persuade us that there is no commonality, there is no habit that should be built. The only habit is this invisible hand that Adam Smith articulated. And it's scientifically made to persuade you not to have a habit of caring for one another, for trees, for the biota that's half dead since 1970, both the marine and the land biota, and on and on and on. That we're an amazing society, we go to Mars, we have the internet, we have VR, we have all these great, great things. And at the same time, we're probably one of the most unintelligent societies ever made, and we sully everything that could be beautiful. So the balance is really, I have this thing, I look through it, when I'm done with it, have I seen the world more closely, or have I pulled away from it? That's where I would look.
That's great. Thank you. I didn't expect that. That's not where I would have taken you, so that's wonderful. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Cool. Well, hard act to follow. So what keeps? I worry that. So essentially, there was an interesting thing I learned from a professor when I was in college. It was called the principle of shame. I'm not sure how widespread this thing is, but as the idea was in journalism that if you point the camera at someone doing something shameful, they'll eventually stop doing it. And that was sort of quickly disproven in the modern social media world. And so I kind of worry that another one of those paradoxes is this idea that that essentially now that there's the internet, people can see things and they can't be as isolated and they can't be as misguided. And it seems that that's not the case. It seems like it's actually opened up greater possibilities for isolation, because people, when all the information they get is mediated, then whoever's kind of controlling it or however they control it themselves can really, really isolate their perspective. So I worry about that, but I also see great potential in this idea of connecting people directly, that we can build systems, and I think that what Karim and Fox are doing, for example, is a great example of connecting people and the potential of that. And so I also stay up trying to be optimistic and think about how we can actually win this game and not let people become isolated.
Can I say one more quick word, Raney? Yeah. Which is just one of my things that that concerns me is with all the power of, I'm not even as worried about traumatizing people, whatever. I think stories need to be told in all kinds of different ways. But I am concerned about propaganda. It's so obviously going to be utilized for propaganda. So how do we give the audience critical thinking in this experience? I talk about in 2005 there was a study being done with it was around 2005. Don't quote me exactly, but it was a study being done with students, and they were asked to look at a website that had a newspaper font and to determine whether they thought that this website had veracity or not. And the students immediately reported that, of course, it was true because it was a newspaper, right? Well, no, it was a fake website. But I would say to you, if you ask students now, they would have the lens of some sort of critical thinking about it, and they wouldn't trust that it was the truth just because it had a certain font. So we just need to think about how do we start, hopefully sooner than a decade, offer people some way to look at this in a critical way so that they can, right now what happened in a beautiful way with web journalism was you could see something and you could Google it or click on a link and find the source documents and have some sense of what was the transparency available. And when the goggles come on right now, the transparency tools are still not readily available. So those are my things about what kind of ethical approaches we need to do to create transparent journalism.
That's great, Nonny. Thanks. I would love people to come up now and ask questions, just because we have about 20 minutes, so I want to make sure we give you guys time. Great. Thank you for standing right up. Hi. That's wonderful. Thanks.
This question's for Karim. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Let's make sure the mic is working. I can give you mine too. Is it? Go
Can
ahead.
you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a lot of trust that your participants put in you. How did you build trust around the technological aspects of it? Something that they might not be able to fully appreciate at the time, or did you need to build trust around the technology of it? And what do you think was the root of your participants to participate in a virtual reality project in which they could possibly be manipulated even more than a traditional kind of documentary?
Well, it's not different than what I do every day as a photojournalist. You meet people. There is this part where they trust you or they don't. They want you, they let you tag along or they're not. When it came to the enemy and the virtual reality and what I was doing, I really, for the prototype, I really spent time before with the different protagonists. I had more than you can see. I had about 7 fighters that I was talking to. Decided finally to go for Abu Khaled and Gilad because they were really well together. It makes a lot of sense for me to have them together, and the answers match a lot of what I was looking. But very much like you would edit interviews, keep people out, and include people into this. Yeah, the trust is super important because once you've captured someone, you can do basically whatever you want with. The easiest thing for me in that case was to go back to Israel and show them the work, and also introduce them to the other. Which they knew through me. It's not so much the protagonist, Gilad or Abu Khaled, because looking at yourself, talking to yourself is a weird experience. I've never done it, but I guess it's a very weird experience. But to have Gilad's wife going through, and she knows her husband way better than anyone else that I know. And she went out of this and says, "You did what you said you would do. This is my husband." And he was nervous. I mean, she could even read him, not the way I do. And this given was for me. It's obviously a very special moment where you put back the work to the people and you really want them to still be on board. Matter of fact, today they both totally on board with the project, and they really appreciate their participation in it and what we're building out of this. When it came to Congo, it's a very different story because I met people who fight in the bush, who don't have access to technologies, had zero education, don't understand 3D to start with, don't understand virtual reality, doesn't even know it exists. So I was more introducing the work as kind of an art piece for reconciliation, putting people in front of each other. Again, I'm not filming them in the same room at the same time because they could kill each other. So I'm filming them apart, but and then explaining this and trying to send back that to themselves a little later and hoping that they're still on board with the project, but I see no reason why they shouldn't.
And the root of their motivation to participate in a VR experience, in a VR...
It's not different than talking to a journalist. They talk to a journalist. So now the medium, they were aware of the medium, but they were not so aware of the medium that says like, okay, that's going to make a difference. No, it's talking to a journalist and being part. Why they be part of this? I think because people are aware that they are at war, then there is maybe other things. I explain my story also, and how I get to see that what part of it was in the trailer. Both sides are human. When I meet them, they're both human with me, and I'm human with them. But they deny that humanity from each other, and it makes sense. Otherwise, you cannot kill each other. You cannot kill someone you've humanized. And so they were interested in that. They're tired of the war. They don't see it going anywhere. They see more and more suffering. They're on the forefront of that suffering, being part of that suffering. And I think it's, in terms of Gilad, it's really a redemption. It's something like, I've killed. And so I need to do something the other way around. And being part of the project was that for him.
Merci.
Pleasure.
Yes, please, sir.
Hi, my name is Ashish Kumar. I'm a professor of nonfiction and advocacy filmmaking, and I also co-direct our Center for Civic Engagement at Hofstra University. It seems that part of what's driving our enthusiasm for virtual reality is that early empirical impulse that people glorified in documentary filmmaking, which was this notion that you would be presented an unfiltered view and you'd be able to bear witness in some way. And for many decades, this impulse for objectivity and what eventually turned out to be a futile debate between subjective and objective was settled. And it seems that now we're back to the basics of looking at this #NoFilter idea of of the VR camera being able to present the world to us. So my question is, how are filmmakers in VR dealing with their own subjectivities? What are they bringing to the table? Because I'm not hearing as much about this impulse that, or this dual impulse towards presenting the world in an unfiltered way, but also carrying our baggage to the sites of filmmaking.
I actually wrote a paper in Documentary Fields Journal addressing this exact issue that you could look at, but certainly anybody else. I think, oh my God, I can't remember, I published it a while ago, but if you go under Nonny in Documentary Fields Journal and look at subjectivity and objectivity, because of the fact that you are creating a subjective experience for your audience member, but how do we look at the information in a way that provides some grounding, that takes it away from just giving, directorially giving the viewer a subjective, because, they're walking around, yeah, but what they're walking around is obviously constructed by the person like me, right? The author, whatever the author is. So how do we go back to looking at all the journalistic questions that we've had? And it addresses some of these issues in sort of detail and talking about historically what have been some of the key moments of these kind of realizations. But there is not too dissimilar of an approach, really. When we make our pieces with Project Syria, we did extensive Bibles down to the rubble on the ground, and we are certainly happy to provide those and show those. But for me, it's more like, how do you provide those and show those, rather than, did we do the exact same research? Yes. But then now, how do we give that extra layer? So those are an issue, but I don't think it necessarily means that we're back to square one. We have all those lessons behind us, and when we make these pieces, we need to think about all the ethics and best practices that have been established all the way through. Because it really wasn't that long ago that we changed the word from objectivity to transparency, right? And I think that they really certainly come to bear in the way that we make these pieces. It's the same thing. Research, images, video, interviews, documentation, Freedom of Information Act. As a journalist, these are all the things that I relied on when I was at Newsweek, when I've written for the New York Times, when I've made documentaries, all the source material, and in the projects that we're working with Raney and Frontline, are absolutely grounded in good journalistic practice, even though it's an embodied subjective experience once you interact or explore or engage with the material.
There's a problem in the question. There are 7 billion people on the planet. There will be 10. If everyone captured their entire life, all the lives are important. If everyone captured their entire life, you would have to live 7 billion times as long, or 10 billion times as long, to experience everything that happened. To make a world, you couldn't possibly do that. What you're actually making is something in which a person is free to act, which means you're not controlling the narrative arc. You don't know what they're going to see. But you can stack it so that whatever path they take, they will encounter a certain density of occurrences that are potentially meaningful. The really key thing to understand is that everything we do, including this conversation and these very comments, is paid for with our lives. Like, we're all mortal, and we're paying with our lives for this attention. So the things that we do have to be worth at least that much time. If I see a movie, I give 2 hours of my time, it has to be worth 2 hours of life. If it's not worth 2 hours of life, I'm angry. If it's worth 2 hours of life, I'm happy. Great deal. I'm going to see it again. So now when we're making worlds, this multiplies, because the only way to see it is to revisit it and spend time in there. And that's actually a huge challenge, to how to do that. And I propose that you're basically making a field, like a minefield of narrative possibilities, some of which will necessarily explode if you go through, and they have to be meaningful. That's a different conception of making.
All right, so taking the time to add a couple of comments after this statement makes me feel like I have a great responsibility not to waste a little bit of your lives. but nonetheless, let me just mention that so my take on the issue of subjectivity and objectivity, there's another kind of another type of subjectivity that I'd like to talk about, and that's what I call subjective computing, because simply using a computing device, which is usually seen as a kind of objective or utilitarian medium in some corners, that also brings a different kind of valence of potential perceived objectivity of this kind of work. And so it's a topic I talk about in my book, Phantasmal Media. In fact, one section of it is called Subjective Computing, and it's about, well, how do we use computing systems, or especially these types of expressive computing systems, to reveal some of the kind of worldviews or ideologies that are implicit in the world that we're not really aware of, these kind of semi-visible ideologies that we have around us when we just see something. For example, in The Enemy, when you see Abu Khaled, and a lot of people have described that they find him threatening because he's wearing a mask. As you listen to him, he says, actually it's because he doesn't want to be recognized because he might face reprisals. So it's actually his vulnerability, not his aggression in this case, which is why he's wearing this. And so after you hear him describe this in this case, then it would say that, well, now I have another kind of worldview from which I can look at this kind of physical appearance and then make my judgment about this. At least I've seen it from these different worldviews, whether or not I agree with it. And so in this kind of case, subjective computing means that we don't see it as sort of objectively capturing and then encoding and then embedding in data structures all the kind of objective experience, but rather the way that we structure our back-end data, the way that we structure all of the kind of utterances that are included, the way that they can be reconfigured is in fact a kind of subjective artistic act in some ways, or creative act, and then we have a kind of responsibility in how we do that. That's actually one of the affordances of our medium. And then besides that, it's also seeing, and this is partly responding to the previous question too, seeing that I think Karim has described that people are not subjects in this case, that they're in some way stakeholders or co-participants. That means they've gone back through the experience, and I always am moved by the anecdote that he tells, which is after months of a period of intense conflict, and he calls them up to see how they're doing, and then he describes that although mentally, emotionally, that there's some kind of shock or trauma that's taken place, physically they're okay. And at the end of that conversation, we ask how they're doing, and if they're okay, then Gilad says, but one more question, which is, how is Abu Khaled doing? And that moment where he asks about the enemy, that's always, every time Karim tells us, I think it's quite moving. It's anecdotal, but it just suggests that there's something that has transpired of meaning there. And it's precisely because they see themselves, in a way, as a kind of co-participant in the project. Even if the situation can't change for them, it could change with this question, where do you see yourself in 10 years? It could change for their children, something that they think. And so again, that's very far from a kind of any project, anything having to do with objectivity. It's actually in some ways about intervention then.
And I think I also just have to mention what I've been calling duality of presence, which after putting the headset on thousands and thousands and thousands of people around the world, literally, that the comment I hear most often is, I felt like I was there. I mean, I knew I was here, but I felt like I was there too. And I think the fact that we can't so readily be split in two, you have to give the audience a little bit of their power back. We aren't that all powerful that we've changed them, taken them somewhere that they aren't smart enough to know that they're somewhere else. So yes, we need that critical thinking, but I also think we have to respect that our audience aren't a bunch of dummies, and they can approach the material with some of their own. As long as they know what they're going into, some of their own, make their own choices. We shouldn't be allowed to always decide whether people should see something or not. Like, they should have some power in this conversation.
I just something with my work is, we make sense of the world through stories, but we remember the world through experience. And what happened when the story became an experience? And this is a big question mark with what I do, but I see people being really moved by what they've seen, and especially when they're close to that conflict, because they can access their enemy, or what has been told they are their enemy. And when it becomes an experience, because it's I'm just wondering what happened after. And this is an exciting development in my work, because I've never thought I would do experience. Never. And I know we remember the world through that. So question mark, and I'll tell you in 1 or 2 years if any changes happen with that.
Cool. So just a brief comment on the responsibilities of the viewer. So I think in film and photography, we have intuitions about how we can be manipulated, and essentially, oh, what's just outside the frame? Why is it so up close? That kind of thing. And the same thing in the video. Why is it so short? We will need new intuitions for VR video. One simple example would be, I think Felix mentioned earlier that he tried to place the camera at kind of a human height, and that made the viewer feel kind of comfortable. But then, of course, he could have placed it a little too high or a little too low in order to influence how the viewer sees it, and that's an effect that's just not really analogous in video or photography.
Yeah, indeed, all of these things have an effect on you, like lower, higher camera. Also, there was this Stanford again. So if I take like an image of you and use a little bit of your facial bone structure and morph it with the face of like Hillary Clinton or another presidential candidate, then you will, they can do that. Then you will like her better, and you will most likely vote for her, instead of because you recognize stuff in the other person's face. And those sort of things are so subtle, and they can happen with like these virtual avatars without us even sort of knowing. So, and if you then talk about maybe some sort of schooling or like critical thinking, it's really difficult to sort of measure or see through those sort of things. So that is still a challenge. Maybe we can use some of your computing to sort of analyze that and see where stuff goes wrong.
So we have time for one more question. Thank you.
So I've heard throughout the presentations today a reference to this idea of we as viewers, and you as in you walk into this space and see this, and I kind of wanted to push back on this idea of a monolithic audience member, and I think I really like the approach that the enemy takes. You mentioned early on, your target audience are the future generations of fighters. I'm wondering from all of you, how do you choose your target audiences? Why do you choose the audiences that you choose? And are there other projects out there that are focusing on the people who are enduring the trauma? Because it seems like there's an assumption that somehow bringing people who are experiencing safety closer to trauma is going to have some positive impact, and I'm not clear what are the steps to that positive impact, and is that supported by any information?
That's a great question. Nonny, do you want to start?
Sure. When you make a piece about, we worked with an investigative journalist named John Carlos Frey to do a piece about use of force by Border Patrol. And it's a very interesting piece because during the kind of post 9/11 buildup of Homeland Security, there was a lot of Border Patrol officers who were put on who actually had criminal records, et cetera, and there was a huge increase of violence against folks trying to come across the border, et cetera. So that piece, story about this guy, Anastasio Hernandez Rojas, who was killed by the Border Patrol, was covered a little bit in the local press, and a little bit even national press, but it really didn't hit anybody. And then we made a VR piece, and we ended up putting it up on BuzzFeed, and now there's almost close to 1 million people who know about that story, and all kinds of comments. And since we've published that piece, I'm not saying it's a direct result, but it's obviously part of the conversation. The Border Patrol has changed their use of force protocols. So, getting word out, it can be effective. It can do things. We've seen Gabo at the UN will talk about the fact that donations go up huge percentage, like 30+%, when they show an accompanying VR experience versus when they just try to show photographs or video. So you see that kind of donation going towards these sort of things. Where do we go? Like with Project Syria, we took it to the World Economic Forum. The idea was hopefully that world leaders would finally turn their lens on what was going on in Syria. That was back in 2013. Didn't seem to have that much of an impact ultimately, even if people felt emotionally impacted by it. So I think you get a wide variety of what kind of changes can come through these pieces. If you want to do things like The Enemy or the kind of pieces that we've done, which very much follows the tradition of turning a lens, light onto a situation that's problematic, and what we're doing with Frontline. you obviously feel like there's a situation here that needs some sort of resolution. And I say that in a very, very understated way. If you didn't continuously try to do this, and you're going to make some mistakes, and you're not going to be perfect, and you're going to forget to think about some things, but ultimately, I think would be more of a disservice to not to attempt to reach whatever audience you can.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. If you look at the origin myths and the fables and the folk tales, and eventually the dramas and the philosophies of cultures throughout all of time and the whole planet, what you see is that the stories that have stayed with us are the stories that were written by a kind of necessity. They weren't gratuitous. They were the stories that needed to be told to particular cultures in order to civilize them. They were ways of the past communicating with the future. The way we make stories at present is not like that. So there are as many episodes for a TV series as can possibly be. There are as many sequels as will sell popcorn. So the manner in which we tell stories is entirely gratuitous. Of course, in that big noise, there are always spectacular and important things. I think the answer to the question is really to what audience and in what way can stories be told such that we will make a better planet. I mean, basically, you'd have to figure out what do children need to see, what world do children need to inhabit, and go through all the years and stages of life and figure that out, and figure out the stories that have the weight of necessity behind them. I don't know. The only other thing about that is that, and I think the people in this room are probably the best audience to understand this fully, is that making is actually a superb exercise for understanding this, right? So granting the ability to more people to make worlds and experience the consequence of choices would be the way to do it. Just let everyone make worlds and play them out and see what happens. So necessity and consequence would be the criteria.
Right, and I want to say something here, just because I think it's such a crucial question, and it's one of the things that we've been looking at from the point of view that when you inhabit these worlds, that self that you become is a kind of virtual identity. And we have virtual identities not just in VR systems, but also in virtual worlds as avatars, video games as characters, social media profiles. So all of these are types of virtual identity. And one of the things we've been trying to understand in the ICE Lab is not just the demographics to target, but also what are the relationships we have to this virtual self that we become within this world. And for example, that means that does that person that is there, is that you or is that somebody else? That means if you're in a video game, do you say that I want this character, I want Lara Croft to move from here to there, or you say I'm moving from here to there? And so that makes a huge difference. And so we've actually found is that it's not just the diversity of within demographics, but it's also people relate to these kind of virtual selves differently. Some people see these virtual selves as a place to explore their identity, or their identity blended with that of somebody else. Some people see it strictly instrumentally, that I just want to encounter a news story, I just want to get from point A to point B, and that's a different type of relationship. And so what we've actually been doing is running a number of different studies, both so even with children, that means going into public schools to see how their virtual identities impact their performance and engagement while learning. And that means if they use one that looks like them, or one that's very abstracted, or one that looks different than them, or one that looks like them that took a lot of effort to create versus an instantly created one, how do they respond differently? And what are the baseline principles and best practices around how we relate to these virtual identities and the different types of these virtual identities? And so we've actually run crowdsourced studies of over 10,000 people now to begin to see and we found interesting results. For example, that if all things being equal, a very abstracted identity improves the performance and engagement, but for certain kind of groups or groups that are considered to face stereotype threat within certain domains that feel that that our stereotype is not being apt within that domain, then using one that actually looks like them, has a sort of higher highs and lower lows kind of impact, and then using a kind of role model that they've selected, then that actually creates a different type of impact, and for some low performing users, then they actually perform better. So again, it's not just what demographics do we target, but how do those demographics relate to the type of technology, and then what are the best practices and baseline principles for then using this in sort of the most empowering and critically engaging sort of ways that can galvanize students or galvanize others to engage the experiences in ways that help them to think differently about what we're modeling or trying to convey to them.
That was wonderful. Thank you. Apropos ending, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, panelists.